Dana really set the stage really well in saying that ASER really, and the spread of it really has hit the holy grail in terms of scale. You heard the staggering numbers yesterday of almost 6 million children being tested in India alone, and that's not even counting how many children outside of that. Almost 3 million households here in India being surveyed, and getting to almost 60,000 villages. If you started to add in the numbers from the other countries, it really is quite staggering. So that really does highlight the scale. Those of us who've been following this internationally since 2006 remember the early days when ASER started to be referenced in international documents and really helped to get learning quite squarely on the agenda. So its effect has been not just spread in terms of the countries that we've heard, but truly getting learning on the global agenda. So we're going to hear from different perspectives from those that have been following this to look at what the possibilities are for the spread of this going forward. What is the promise of this and the limitations now that the global community is focused on learning, and at a country level, as you heard John Mugo speaking about, that when they were first coming and saying with the news of are the children learning, the governments were saying yes, but now they're saying, okay, we agree with you that there is a learning crisis, and now what? So we really want to focus on what is the promise of this approach, and perhaps even what are some of the limitations. So I'm going to start with Dr. Madhav Chavan, who I don't know if he needs any introduction at all to all of us in the room, but he's the president and CEO of Pratham, and I think I have this correctly, who was the visionary or a visionary of the ASER approach. So Madhav, I'd like you to both help us take a step looking back and a step looking forward. And looking back, just to hear your perspectives on what actually makes this such a uniquely powerful approach. And looking forward, what conditions need to be in place for this approach to get traction and be successful? I forgot to say the other night, those of us who were at the Pratham event noticed that when you hit time, they passed you a lovely red rose. And since our time is so short, you're going to have to deal with my drawing of a flower.
But so how many minutes do I have?
You have 5.
Ooh. So I don't, at least in my context, I don't like the word visionary, because there's nothing to, I don't really vision things. The way I think ASER happened was, way back in 2002, we had started noticing it. Rukmini had done some assessment in municipal schools in Mumbai, and the first time she brought it out was, there's a long tail, and everybody's talking about learning, but there's a huge number of children in a classroom who don't learn, and we noticed that. But we focused on just the reading component in just about 2002. And when we started looking at how to teach children to read, came out a method and we called it L2R, learning to read. And when we were doing that, it looked like it was a very simple method. Within about 3 or 4 weeks, children who could read words became reasonable fluent readers. We worked out a way of doing that. And as a part of that, a tool evolved. And recently, when I was looking through some old files, actually the word, the term annual status of education report was in one of my proposals in 2004, written to NOVIP, who had been our great supporters. Although it was not quite annual status of education report at that time, but annual status was definitely a part of that. So the thinking around doing something like this was a part of where we were going. And it seemed like this was a very important thing to handle. Reading as an important thing to handle came to us more or less here. In fact, I can tell you that Job, what's Job's last name? Zakaria, from UNESCO, UNICEF, had mentioned in Rajasthan, why don't you see if children can read? And I got that feedback. And I said, yeah, we've never actually seen how to teach children read. So I think these things start coming together. When you see that there is a problem and you start to attack that problem, things start happening. And that's how we actually started thinking about it. And the big chance came when there was a change in the government, and the Prime Minister himself and the Finance Minister at that time made loud pronouncements that they were going to look for outcomes and not just outlays to measure their progress. And I happened to be in the Prime Minister's Advisory Committee, and I said, why don't we do this kind of report? And Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia said, well, show me what you can do. And I had forgotten this, but now Somasundaram yesterday mentioned, and somebody else had said, that we actually ran a pilot in 19 states in 2004 to show the government that this can be done very easily. After the pilot was done, they said, now that you've done it, do more. They had a practical problem. They said, if we do it, if we give you money, if the government does it, then it's going to get completely botched. If we give you money, then all sorts of government experts will start sitting on your back and you won't be able to move. And so it just went on happening. I think this is something that you got to see. You don't sit under a tree and get a vision. When you're working on problems, we're trying to sort out, you fix on the right thing to do and what's working, and if you're vigilant about it, things just start happening. And so the mantra there is to keep walking, as they say. And that's what happened. And when we did the national ASER, again, it was just a matter of can we multiply 6 times over. We had a size and we said, all of India, why not? And the good thing about, or bad thing about Pratham is nobody says no. And it's all blamed on me that you said it, so we did it. So it started happening. At that time, and this is true about Pratham's birth as well. When Pratham was born in Mumbai, we were not thinking India at all. We were thinking only about Mumbai. It just so happened that other people in other cities started getting inspired by what we were doing in Mumbai, and Pratham started spreading. So it seems to be happening all over again. That we did not go and tell the Kenyans and the Tanzanians to do ASER. Somehow the word spread. Hewlett Foundation was instrumental in that. And when they found it, and this was a condition, that you should feel like doing it. It's not about us coming and starting a Pratham chapter. That's not going to work. You've got to find your own roots. And now it is growing. So I think the vision is in retrospect. I think Lant once upon a time said it was a strategic masterstroke. But that also is in hind vision, that it turned out to be, we did not say, now this is what we are going to do. Maybe we should learn to do that. And I think we are thinking about it now, saying that what's the next step? Now we've done the reading. I think now children learning by themselves, self-directed learning is probably the next step to go. And we are thinking about it. Maybe 10 years down the road, we could discuss that it was a strategic stroke.
So Madhav, one of the key things that you just said, I'm going to ask him a follow-up question.
Okay.
Just quickly, one of the key things, the conditions that you mentioned in place was that there should be an organic commitment to this. And I think you heard that in the last panel, that each person or each organization came to this themselves, that they wanted to do this. Are there other key conditions that you see have to be in place for this to be successful and to gain traction?
Confucius says a lock with too many keys is not a good lock. No, I don't think Confucius said that. So you have to, I just made it up. So there can be only one key. You can't have too many keys. So I think it's important that you are rooted in your own reality. And as Bela was describing, we told them, you have to do this, you have to do this. But they had to accept it themselves. We could not force it. Luckily, we were not funders. We were merely friends, better than later on, friends. And it was up to them to accept and shape the reality. See, in every country, the relationship between the NGO and the government is different. In India, although we have this huge size and all that, the government just ignores us or thinks they can ignore us. Or we think they ignore us. Maybe they don't. Our relationships in different states are very different. In some states, the government doesn't want to talk to us. In some states, the government really wants to talk to us. So I think it has to be. There's no other choice. It has to be different. It will be different in different countries. People are different. Pratham is supposed to be a very large group in India. Compared to the size of India, we really are not that big. Yeah, maybe we are. But in other countries, you may say, no, no, we want to do the little groups coming together. It's a more federal thing, as Bela described it. So I think there's one key. Find your own reality and build it there, but be committed to a frame that this is what we are going to go for. If we do that, you find the way. That's what I think.
Thank you. Next, we are fortunate to have Lant Pritchett here, who's from the Harvard Kennedy School, and who also I could say is probably, as you heard yesterday, once you've been around Pratham or ASER, you can't really leave. I think he might fit in that category as someone who's been around and has been learning a lot. And Lant, you've written about the need for disruptive innovation in education to actually improve learning. So my question to you is, how do you view ASER? Is it one of these disruptive innovations? And the spread of this type of approach, what is the promise that it offers and also the limitations that you see?
So I think first we should be clear about what a disruptive innovation is. And what a disruptive innovation is not an innovation that advances the field in the way that the field is concernedly conceiving of it. That's what they call a sustaining innovation. So doing more of the same is a sustaining innovation, whereas a disruptive innovation actually does something worse and yet meets a need. And I think, when the first PC or the first Apple computer was being invented, it was an absolute disgrace inside the electrical engineering community to work on this, because it was a toy, it was a kludge. Everybody who was serious about electrical engineering was working on the mainframe computers. And so no self-respecting person at IBM or Wang or all these companies you've never heard of because they all went out of business would work on the PC because it was seen as being an inferior technology. The beauty of that is that it creates the space in which you can do something really new and really different. And so I think ASER is a classic disruptive innovation. It is not state-of-the-art pedagogical psychometric practice. It's what can citizens do by themselves at a level of the reality that they perceive it that can change their reality using the tools they have. And so that's brilliant. And then the second thing is it creates the space for other disruptive innovations. And what do I mean by that? The thing is that if you don't have a clear metric of success, it's very tough to convince people to do something new because they just want to do the old. And so in my view, the education establishment globally was very much caught into let's do more of the same. And without clear metrics of what it was they were trying to accomplish, smaller class sizes, more formal qualifications for teachers, more girls' toilets, all of that just became ins and of themselves. And until you had a standard, you couldn't say we're doing things differently that might look very different from what you think is a good school, but are going to work better. So the whole idea of levels by learning and ASER, I think, are very intertwined in that they're both disruptive. They both go in and say, why are you having all kids of the same age sit in the same classroom when they don't know the same thing? Why are you trying to teach homogeneous content to heterogeneous learners? Why not actually teach content to learners? But you can't prove that that disruptive thing that looks awkward and worse is better unless you have an independent standard. So I think it's a double disruptive innovation in that it's a disruptive innovation in and of itself is that it takes back very powerfully the assessment and adjudication about what citizens mean about quality education from the experts. And then secondly, it creates a standard. So, an example that there's a track and field event called the high jump in which you try and jump over a bar. And it's a very simple contest. Who can jump over the highest bar? And up until about 1968, everybody had jumped over the bar frontwards. And then there was one guy, Dick Fosbury, who said, maybe I can go higher if I jump over backwards. But every person who had ever trained anyone to do the high jump knew that was wrong. Right? It was like, if you were being taught to be a high jumper, you were being taught this is how you do it. And then Dick Fosbury said, no, I think I'm going to try it this other way. And went over and raised literally raised the bar. But unless there was a clear bar, if high jumping had been judged on the beauty of the style, it could have never become adopted because everybody would have said that's not a good-looking high jump. It's an ugly-looking high jump. So I think the ASER experience is a doubly disruptive innovation in that it's taken back from the psychometricians and the sort of elite how we adjudicate what our kids are learning and why. And then secondly, it's created space for other disruptive innovations because you can say, look, we have this clear metric of what we're trying to do. We're going to try something out of the blue like self-directed learning. Self-directed learning has no chance as a disruptive innovation of becoming adopted unless there's a clear metric against which you can judge.
So again, just a quick follow-up. So you've described really well what the possibilities and the promise of this are. And as today we're all here to listen to what this global call of action is, are there any cautionary notes, or what do you see being the limitations?
No cautionary notes. Go, 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 go.
Can I give a cautionary note? Cautionary note is don't go, 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 go. Think about it.
Nah, go. Let me think about it.
Yeah. Okay. We'll see what we get from the questions from the audience on this. So I'm going to turn to Aaron Benavot, who sits at UNESCO and is the director of the Global Monitoring Report.
This will probably go. This is a better.
Oh, yeah.
So Aaron, you're closely involved in looking at, well, actually having to assess the EFA goals to date, and actually in the conversations that are going on in terms of what the new Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically for education, will be going forward, kind of generally. So I have kind of a two-part question for you. The first part is, how do you see such an approach, a citizen-led assessments that's happening within these 8 countries now, or 9 countries? How is this informing the global community about learning now that it's squarely on the agenda? And then the second part is, do you consider this a viable method and approach to both strengthen accountability and support learning? And I think this came up in the last panel, specifically at looking at the equity issue of all children. And we'd be really interested in your perspective on this, because we know this you're looking at many different kinds of assessments, government assessments, regional assessments, and then where does this one sit vis-a-vis those others?
So before I answer your question, Lynn, which is a very challenging one, let me first say how much I appreciate being here, and I just want to say it's really an honor to be at this very important occasion, and I want to congratulate everybody who's been involved in Pratham. The GMR over the years has been made a real attempt to take data that have been created by the ASER community and publish it in the EFA Global Monitoring Reports, and we're also very proud of this approach. So let me just say a few things. Once again, the perspective that I bring here is a perspective of kind of looking at assessments from a global or international viewpoint. One of the things that we see if we go back 15 years in the year 2000 is that the number of assessments and the number of countries involved in conducting assessments was actually quite limited. Most of the assessment activity was involved with the International Association of the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, the TIMS, the PEARLs, and so forth. There was yet no PISA. SACMEC had got started. There was no assessment in Latin America. These were all government-led, some of them cross-national, some of them regional. But since 2000, we see a huge, enormous increase in the number of countries that are conducting assessments or participating in different kinds of assessments. And this is at all the different levels, both the international level, the regional level, and at the national level. In the new report that we hope to launch here in India in April of this year, and here in Delhi, We will provide a global mapping of all the national level assessments that are being carried out or have been carried out over the last 10 years. And you will find in this data that during the period before the Dakar conference, only 70 countries had conducted a national level assessment. And since then, twice the number of countries, 142 countries, have carried out at least one national assessment, and I'm including here the citizen-led assessments of the Pratham family. And so we see an enormous increase in the kind of attempts to measure learning outcomes that really try to capture one of these key dimensions of quality education that emerges from the Education for All movement. But having said this, the question then becomes who conducts these assessments and with what impact do they have? And these questions are much more difficult to answer. Certainly, we know that most of the assessments that I've made reference to are either produced by researchers, sometimes through an independent NGO like the IEA, or through governments and through government associations. The citizen-led assessment is a very new and disruptive innovation, as we've heard, and maybe it's the ugly learning assessment that we've seen here. For me, the question is, does it build capacities in countries? And I think this is an important question to ask. Many of the other assessment activities often are involved with experts who come from various countries and with certain kinds of expertise, measure the learning outcomes, provide a report, and with that they've kind of concluded their responsibilities. What we see, certainly through Pratham and also in some other assessment exercises, is a real attempt to build capacities in countries, not only among experts, but among many different stakeholders who have an interest in trying to understand and measure and examine what it is that schools are producing and what kind of learning takes place outside of schools. So this is hugely important. The question also becomes how these assessments are used, and we have many examples of assessments that are extremely rigorous in terms of the methodology, that are standardized and comparable across countries, but they're really not used by countries. They end up being in a report that's placed in some drawer in some office in the Ministry of Education, never to see the day of light. And so then there becomes a question of, does the findings and the results and the insights from these kinds of assessment activities really close the feedback loop? Do we learn something from these assessments that helps us to improve how teachers teach, how parents engage with their children in learning at home, in the kinds of curricular materials that are made available, in the kinds of pedagogy and pedagogical practices that take place? This is really a key, for me, an enormously important criterion to decide which assessment activities, as it were, are more or less effective, is to the extent to which they can close this kind of feedback loop. And I think that one of the clear advantages of the Pratham family of assessments is that this is something that they've tried to do from the very beginning, is to provide feedback to local communities, to local policymakers that can inform the kinds of decisions they made. And this is enormously important. One would hope that this would also feed into teacher training institutes and other kinds of activities. So I think there are many different advantages. One of the other key advantages of this kinds of assessment is that it focuses on where the real variation in learning takes place. And the real variation of learning takes place between schools, between communities within countries. And so having national citizen-led assessments or even government-led or conjoined, these are really places where we learn the most about what factors can be, I wouldn't say manipulated, but at least can be impacted to try to improve learning. I think there's enormous limitations in looking at the big international assessments, the PISAs, the TIMS, because they focus on between country variation, which is important, but it doesn't really capture to the same extent the importance of variation and especially inequalities within countries. Many of the speakers have talked about this. So let me just speak a little bit to this question of maybe some of the disadvantages or some of the liabilities. I take a slightly different stance than my colleague Lant about these issues. It isn't just going for it, it's how you move forward smartly and what kind of decisions you do make. So As I said, I think that the question one wants to ask is, how do we, what kinds of skills and subjects are being assessed? And are there unintended consequences to the fact that we're concentrating only on reading and mathematics? Much of the international community is becoming very interested in global citizenship education, in education for sustainable development. Many countries are interested in the kind of moral and ethical human beings that are produced in schools, the knowledge they may have about their historical and geographical environments. We also want assessments that go beyond the traditional foundational skills that talk about the social science knowledge, the other kinds of skills, not just problem solving and critical thinking, but also things to do with the other subject areas that are often being offered and mandated and required, things to do with even religion or ethics or moral education, which are important in many parts of the world. So I think one of the things that we learn when we look at it globally is that there are many assessments at the national level that do look at subject areas beyond the triumphant math, reading, and science. And I think we need to pay attention to these kinds of assessments because they help us to expand our vision of what we might look at, of what kind of a child we want to, that parents and communities want to produce. What kind of globally conscious citizens do we want? And so I think that we need to think about some of the unintended consequences of assessing only certain kinds of skills and not others. And I take a little bit issue that I'm a little bit concerned that if we only see learning outcomes as the exclusive dimension of quality education, we tend to ignore how important some basic conditions of school life are. Do they have textbooks? Do they have a nutritious meal? Do they have a roof over their heads? Is there one teacher per grade level? These are other aspects of quality education that if focus only on learning and the outcome of learning and not are these basic other components of, are there qualified teachers? Is there a curriculum in place, and so on and so forth? These are also, I think, very important aspects of quality education that need to be looked at. I could go on, but I think that's enough at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I won't ask you the follow-up question, but I will without allowing you to answer it. Maybe it'll come up from the audience. But it makes me wonder whether you see it more as a mosaic to all the issues and this being one part of that mosaic, or whether you would say in the next 5 to 10 years whether this kind of approach could move beyond the way that they're thinking right now. So maybe just think about that for a little bit. I'm going to turn to Ruth Levine, who is the program director for the Global Development and Population Program at the Hewlett Foundation. And as you've all heard, the Hewlett Foundation has been supporting ASER and the spread of this approach to other countries with Uwezo and Bekungo and Jangando and others that have been coming online. And so Ruth, recently you revised your education strategy, and in that you stated that you will continue to focus on this kind of approach, which suggests that you see it to be really powerful and that it actually is improving accountability or has the promise to do so. So could you talk a little bit from your perspective, more generally from both transparency and accountability that you look at in other sectors, why you are continuing this focus? And then the second piece is there a particular window of opportunity at this moment to really spread this kind of citizen-led assessments? And talk a little bit about what window of opportunity you see exists.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. It's really an honor to be here and among such enlightened experts on issues related to education, transparency, accountability, citizen movements, and many of the other topics that we're talking about. Let me break down my response in terms of that you asked it. What's the Hewlett Foundation perspective, and then what's the kind of broader environment? So from our perspective, the kinds of factors that really contribute to our decision to sustain support for this work and to continue to accompany and learn from the citizen-led assessments in many different countries now. Those factors include that we have a deep belief that there's power in information, particularly information in the hands of people, not captured entirely by governments and by agencies that have a mandate to collect, process data, and release the bits in a synthesized form that they choose to. We have a really deep appreciation for the value of innovations that emerge from particular contexts developed by people who have commitments to improve conditions in their own environments, in their own countries, and in their own neighborhoods. And what we've seen with this is not only that the kind of original ASER work emerged in that way, but that there's an inspiring set of adaptations that have taken place as this idea has been translated, adapted, worked with by equally committed people in other countries. And we see a real potential now, maybe in ways that are increasing, to connect the movement to improve educational outcomes with the movement toward greater transparency, openness, accountability on the part of government. And so that's a community that we work with across many different sectors, and we see some real opportunities to advance those connections going forward. But we're not doing this in any way that suggests that all the problems have been solved and the idea and the next step is simply to expand or do more. I think we all recognize across the family of people working on this that there are lots of technical problems yet to work out, and there are also real challenges in making sure that there's as significant impact from all the energy that's put into this as possible. And for that reason, we've invested ourselves in a pretty large evaluation. We're working on trying to understand what the results of that evaluation are telling us, and we're really looking forward to working with partners on sort of the next stages, the improvements that can come over the coming years. So let me take a broader perspective as a kind of observer of the world of global development, such as it is, and talk about why there's a really special moment now for more, better, more intensive work around citizen-led assessments. And it really is, I think, because of the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. So, as we all know, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, focused essentially exclusively on expanding access to schooling. And partly because of many of you in this room and many others around the world, the next set of International Development Goals will almost certainly include learning as a key element, in addition to continuing to expand access, because that challenge has not yet been fully met. And so if it is the case, and we all need a crystal ball to know what's going to happen in September when the next round of International Development Goals are agreed by essentially all the member states of the United Nations. If it's true that there will be a kind of access plus learning goal, then there will be a massive challenge to figure out both how to measure learning and how to engage all of the countries. And I'm not just talking about the global south, I'm talking about all countries in the world in really addressing what is a learning crisis in many countries and communities. And so for the sake of, there's going to be a need to raise awareness in many different countries of the extent of the learning crisis that exists. And if you haven't read yet Lant's essay at the beginning of the ASER 2014 report about how assessments like this can help to define problems in ways that can attract attention of the policy community. I really commend it to you. So I think that there will be a real a need for that kind of work in many countries. I also think that there's a recognition now that the solutions to the challenges in education do not only come from government. And so getting both the measurement and the conversation out of exclusively the government or public sector is something that I think will come as many countries take on the challenge of improving learning outcomes. And finally, this has been raised many times, I think that there will be, within the Sustainable Development Goal kind of accountability framework, in education and in other areas, I think there will be a need to find ways to validate externally and independently the data that governments and UN agencies will be producing. So again, I see a huge role for this effort and similar types of independent efforts. So that was kind of a long list. I hope in it I conveyed enthusiasm not just from the Hewlett Foundation, but I think from a broad community that see this as a real contributor to what will happen in the post-2015 world.
Thank you, Ruth, for offering us the perspectives both from within the foundation and also more broadly. I'm going to turn now to Sarah Ruto. Sarah is, as of I think January 1st, she is within ASER International. Previously, up until December 31st, Sarah was with UWEZO. She first started with UWEZO Kenya and came on that infamous trip first in 2008 to see, and often will share stories of how they didn't quite think this was actually going to be viable until day 6 of the trip, when they got convinced by some Pratham and ASER folks to look in the mirror and challenge themselves of why they didn't think this would work. And she led the efforts with ASER UWEZO, and then she led the efforts across the region, and now she stepped more broadly into looking at how this approach really can spread both across Africa and beyond. So Sarah, as someone who has had different hats and vantage points, I really want to ask you to speak not on behalf of the Global South, but what you see that opportunity being. Particularly, how do you see leading this charge to spread this approach to other countries? What do you see the space there for other countries to come in? And then as that happens, we'll just state it to be so that it will happen. Can you just paint us a picture of what the world will look like in 5 to 10 years from the perspective of policymakers, from the perspective of kids, and indeed even from the perspective of civil society? So I'm asking a big question of you, Sarah, so you have some time.
Okay, thank you. I've had 2 questions. What is the potential for other countries? And perhaps I'll begin it from a personal point of view. And begin with the latest entrant, which is Nigeria. When I met Mo and Gori, one of the first things they told me is, we'd like you, because they were so convinced. And they felt that the East African story is what was needed for the Nigerian Economic Summit for them to see what they are seeing and what they are feeling. And so they invited me, and I talked about what we are doing in East Africa. And then Mo told me that and the Nigerian Economic Summit basically brings the elite, the decision makers from public-private sector. And that the reaction, because she was sitting in the kitchen, was from the key people. She said, they said, this is what we have been waiting for. It seemed by listening to our story, there was an aha moment that this is something that can help us discuss about education, better learning for our children, because nobody's in disagreement. Everybody wants something good for their own child, perhaps for all our children. And it's the same reaction we have seen when we step back, when we were in UWEZO, when Mali came to, after coming to ASER, they came to Kenya, and they felt the same kind of passion. The same thing we saw when South Sudan came, the same thing we saw when Malawi came, when Ghana came. There have been a number of countries who have actually come to experience. So that is what gives me hope that there is space and there is potential, because everybody feels what we felt in 2008. I think it is the ASER approach provides something tangible, something you can understand as an individual. When you're seated in the kitchen, you understand what it is that you need to do. And it provides an opportunity for you to initiate a different conversation on the same old thing. So it is simple yet powerful. I know it has changed the character of civil society participation, because before, civil society were advocacy, they were often called activists. But today, because you come with evidence, it changes, it tilts. There's a robustness, and all of a sudden, people who never listened to you before can listen to you. So I think there is potential. But many of the countries, we were able to take the next step forward because we had a friend somewhere, a funder somewhere. So many of the countries I have mentioned, like Ghana, like Malawi, after all this initial passion, and still emails go on across, have not gone the next step. And that shows the interconnectedness of the world. Everybody needs a helping hand, and therefore it is important to do that. Your second question has asked me to dream about the world in 5 years. And so I'd like to dream about it in these 3 levels. What does it mean for the person or for the partners who act? And what I have seen, and I keep on seeing, even when I'm feeling tired and jaded, is that there is something about this approach that keeps you invigorated. Change does not begin with many other people. It has to begin with you and what you're doing in your small space. And it doesn't matter. I thought that after the first Uwezo, nobody will listen to us, and that, again. And I did the second one and then the third one. And the same feel I had with the first launch is still the same when I feel the evidence, though bad, as Madhav said, still gives you that hope and potential that, this is something, we can still do something about it. The ASER approach gives you hope. Therefore, it has a bit of romanticism in it. Maybe that is why, it makes you dream. And where would we be without dreams? But at the same time, it will also make you to want more. So as a person, for example, it had gotten to a point where nobody was telling me the findings. They'd come and tell me the title of the Uwezo reports is Are Our Children Learning? And people would come to me and tell me, our children are not learning. And then they tell me the results. 3 out of 10 children are not learning. So I figured my business in that part of the world was over, because the next part would be, now what do we do about it? Mm-hmm. So this approach will make you want to do more. And many of the friends I have met in ASER through Pratham are still in the family, but have also started doing something else, which I think is good, because then it allows you to grow. So I think that is the world I'd like to see, that individually, through this, we will grow because we are invigorated, we are given hope to do more. The world I'd like to see for policymakers is that I hope they will be a little bit more informed so that they can make better decisions, different decisions. I think that policymakers have become a little bit too serious about the world, their world, and therefore, when you go to our classrooms all reflect the jaded adults we are. They do not reflect the space of children, which is a playful one. And through this process, maybe it is time for us to go back to what it ought to be. I was very happy when we came the first day, and the CEO was actually the band leader of the Pratham band. And I think that is the best way sometimes to invigorate, through different means, through song, through dance, through play. So that's the world I'd like to see, one that is not too serious. Surely there should be more dancing in this world than we are seeing currently. And obviously, therefore, for children, you'd like to see that they're a little bit more happy and that they learn and that they become what they want to be. Thank you.